December 16, 1944. Row 5:31 hours. The small town of Monschau near the German-Belgian border was still wrapped in darkness when Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, of the U.S. 46th Artillery Group, stood over a row of classified ammunition crates. He knew that opening them meant defying strict orders from the highest levels of Allied command. Through his field glasses, Axelson could see German formations gathering. It was the opening move of what would become Hitler's final major offensive in the West, Operation Watch on the Rhine. On the northern edge of the battlefield, the 38th Cavalry Squadron was bracing for a blow it couldn't withstand alone. "Sir, German artillery preparation has started," Axelson's operations officer reported. "The 38th is calling for immediate fire support." Axelson's eyes turned to the stacks of shells stamped with the code T98. These were proximity-fused rounds, strictly banned for use over land. Almost no one outside a small circle of scientists and senior commanders even knew such weapons existed. Inside each shell was a miniaturized radio system designed to detonate the explosive charge about 30 feet above the ground. The result was a cone of deadly fragments that made foxholes and trenches nearly useless as cover. "Load the VT shells," Axelson ordered, using the misleading code name Variable Time to keep enemy intelligence in the dark. "We'll need everything we've got." 47 minutes later, German troops would encounter a weapon they had declared impossible to build. These shells were not just advanced, they represented an industrial achievement that highlighted the massive gap between American production power and German expectations. When fired, each shell exploded at around 30 feet altitude, sending supersonic steel fragments down and out in a 60-yard radius at speeds near 3,000 feet per second. No foxhole was deep enough, no overhead cover thick enough to protect soldiers from that storm of metal. U.S. military records would later confirm the proximity fuse as the third most important technological breakthrough of World War II, behind only radar and the atomic bomb. Yet unlike those, its existence was a total secret, until the Germans felt its impact on the battlefield. The principle was simple: detonate at the right height. The execution was anything but simple. Engineers had designed a miniature radio transmitter and receiver tough enough to survive the crushing acceleration of artillery fire, about 20,000 times the force of gravity. The device could measure its distance from the ground in real time and trigger detonation at the perfect moment. Each fuse carried 4 hardened vacuum tubes, smaller than a coffee cup yet strong enough to survive forces that would destroy human tissue. Development had begun in 1940 and consumed about $1 billion at the time, equal to roughly $15 billion today. By late 1943, U.S. factories were producing 40,000 of these fuses every day. By the end of the war, production reached 70,000 per day. Between 1942 and 1945, exactly 22,073,181 proximity fuses were manufactured. Of these, 21,685,157 went into combat use, while 380,324 were consumed in testing. Each fuse contained about 130 carefully made parts, with tolerances as fine as 2/10,000th of an inch. Assembly required clean room conditions and the labor of 110,000 workers, many of whom never knew the true purpose of what they were building. A clever wind-driven generator solved the power problem. After the shell left the gun barrel, a small propeller flipped into the airstream, generating electricity to activate the circuit. That meant the fuse stayed inert until fired, safe to handle, impossible to detect, and immune to jamming until seconds before detonation. The first major use of proximity-fused shells against ground targets came at 06:18 hours on December 16, 1944, just 47 minutes after the German offensive began. Axelson's 46th Artillery Group fired without authorization, forced by battlefield urgency. Eisenhower would not request formal clearance until December 19th, and restrictions were fully lifted by December 21st. The effect was immediate. German troops trained to dive into foxholes during artillery fire were cut down when the shells exploded overhead instead of striking the earth. After-action reports from the 99th Infantry Division described extraordinary casualties inflicted on German formations near Krinkelt within just 12 minutes of fire. German medical units were overwhelmed, and advancing soldiers were forced to step over their own dead. Around Malmedy by December 23rd, intelligence estimated that 2,000 German troops had already been killed by these rounds. Some attackers, shaken to the core, even charged straight into American fire, shouting, "Kamerad!" The psychological shock matched the physical devastation. Conventional high-explosive shells wasted much of their effect. Half of the fragments buried in the ground, most of the rest spraying sideways, leaving only a tiny percentage that traveled upward. A soldier in a well-built foxhole had up to a 90% chance of survival. Proximity fuses changed that math. Airbursts at 30 feet sent nearly all fragments downward and outward in an inverted cone. The lethal radius jumped from 25 yards to 60 yards. Instead of 60 square feet of lethal coverage, an airburst created about 3,000 square feet, a 50-fold increase. Foxholes and trenches that had saved lives in countless battles were suddenly useless. This was not just a small improvement. It was a revolution in artillery warfare. The shells themselves were a triumph of American manufacturing precision. The vacuum tubes inside, a triode for oscillation and detection, a pentode for amplification, a thyrotron for triggering, and sometimes a diode for rectification, were unlike anything used in civilian electronics. Each was specially hardened for one purpose: to survive the impossible forces of an artillery shot and work flawlessly in the fraction of a second before detonation. The proximity fuse was the hidden weapon that redefined artillery in World War II. And in December 1944, Colonel Axelson's decision put it into combat for the first time on land, forever changing the battlefield. The development of the proximity fuse was one of the greatest examples of American science and industry working together during World War II. In August 1940, the British Tizard mission arrived in the United States, bringing with it some of Britain's most guarded military secrets. These included early radar research and the theoretical idea of a proximity fuse. British scientists had already shown that the concept could work, but they lacked the factories and production power to turn it into a real weapon. That same year, in June 1940, the National Defense Research Committee was formed. It ranked the proximity fuse as its second highest priority, right after radar. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory was selected as the main center for development, while American industry prepared to mass-produce the device. The technical problems were enormous. A fuse had to survive forces of 20,000 G when fired, remain functional in temperatures ranging from -50 degrees to +120 degrees in F, withstand spins up to 30,000 RPM, and still work after months of storage in environments from the tropics of the Pacific to the freezing winters of Europe. Section T, the project's code name, eventually employed about 3,000 scientists and engineers. They invented new plastics that wouldn't shatter under extreme stress, created miniature vacuum tubes strong enough to survive acceleration that destroyed normal electronics, and developed assembly techniques accurate to within 1/10,000th of an inch. On January 29, 1942, the first successful test proved the concept, when a proximity-fused shell destroyed a drone aircraft over Chesapeake Bay. By August 1942, the USS Cleveland carried proximity-fused anti-aircraft rounds, and the results were immediate. Japanese aircraft losses climbed sharply. On January 5, 1943, the USS Helena made history near Guadalcanal by downing a Japanese dive bomber with just 4 proximity-fused shells. Because of the risk of unexploded shells being recovered by the enemy, ground use of the fuse was prohibited. At sea, however, there was no such danger, so the U.S. Navy could use the weapon freely. The statistics were striking. With conventional ammunition, it took about 1,162 rounds to bring down a single plane. With proximity fuses, the average dropped to only 310 rounds per kill. By 1944, proximity fuse shells made up 25% of ammunition fired, yet accounted for 51% of all enemy aircraft destroyed. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the weapon's impact became legendary. Over 400 Japanese aircraft were lost, and proximity fuses played a decisive role. That same summer, the British began using the technology against Germany's V-1 flying bombs. On June 12, 1944, only days after D-Day, anti-aircraft guns on the English coast raised their success rate from 17% to 79% in less than a month. General Sir Frederick Pyle, head of Britain's anti-aircraft command, called it the most remarkable scientific achievement in the history of warfare. These battlefield successes made the ban on land use harder to justify. Field commanders grew frustrated, watching their men die in situations where proximity fuses could have saved them. The crisis in the Ardennes in December 1944 finally forced a change. Ironically, German intelligence had already suspected the existence of such a weapon. In October 1944, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's staff noted a sharp rise in Luftwaffe losses. They even recovered shell fragments showing unusual patterns consistent with airbursts. In his report to the German High Command, OKW, Kesselring warned, "Evidence suggests Americans possess altitude-triggered ammunition. If adapted to ground artillery, effects on infantry would be catastrophic. Recommend immediate investigation." The reply from Berlin dismissed his concerns. Captured records later showed the assessment read, "Proximity detonation under battlefield conditions impossible. Allied success due to radar direction and increased gun density. No action required." That mistake would prove fatal. German scientists had been trying to create similar technology since the early 1930s. They experimented with 30 to 50 different designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine noise, electrostatic field devices, and radio-based systems. None worked. In 1940, Hitler personally ordered that any project not ready for production within 6 months be cancelled, which effectively ended their program. The irony was extreme. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces captured about 20,000 proximity fuses. Yet they never realized what they had found. German engineers believed such technology could not exist, convinced that the stress of firing would destroy any electronics. The greatest intelligence find of the war was literally in their hands, and they ignored it. Production in the United States was massive and spread across 5 main companies. Crosley Corporation produced 2 million units. Sylvania built 7 million. RCA's 2 plants made a combined 9 million. Eastman Kodak manufactured 4 million. And McQuay Norris produced 9 million. Sylvania's plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts was the single largest producer, making 26% of the total. The Crosley factory in Cincinnati employed 8,000 workers and turned out as many as 6,500 fuses per day at peak. Their quality standards were astonishing. Parts were measured to within 1/15,000th of an inch. The plant consumed more electricity than some entire German cities, and air conditioning held the temperature within 2 degrees to prevent parts from expanding. Despite a rejection rate of 28% on completed units, production was so high that the U.S. could afford to discard more defective components each day than Germany produced in a month. Sylvania was the leader in component manufacturing, building 95% of the miniature vacuum tubes. More than 100 million were made by 10,000 workers across 15 plants, dedicated entirely to the VT program. In total, over 100 American companies and 2,000 suppliers, from chemical plants to precision machine shops, contributed. The workforce was largely female. At Sylvania's Ipswich plant, 9,000 of the 10,000 employees were women, many from the surrounding communities. They worked in clean rooms with filtered air, using microscopes to place parts with tolerances as fine as 1/20,000th of an inch. Each operator typically performed one specialized task, repeated thousands of times per shift. By Christmas Day 1944, the restriction was gone. Proximity fuses were being used across the Ardennes front. During the Battle of the Bulge, U.S. forces fired about 200,000 of these shells, changing the course of the fight and proving once and for all that the weapon was one of the most decisive innovations of the war. General George S. Patton was not an immediate supporter of the proximity fuse. Known for favoring tanks and mobile warfare, he was skeptical about artillery innovations. That changed after Christmas 1944. On December 25th and 26th, Patton's Third Army reported killing about 700 German soldiers at Echternach using proximity-fused shells. His opinion turned overnight. Patton declared, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." The psychological effect on German troops was enormous. Prisoner interrogations showed soldiers felt completely powerless against shells that burst above them. Their training had always stressed taking cover in foxholes, trenches, or natural depressions. Suddenly, those defenses became death traps. One captured officer admitted, "Your shells explode exactly at treetop height. Always the same. We tried everything, deeper holes, concrete, dispersal. Nothing worked." That consistency, detonation at roughly 30 feet, was achieved through precise radio measurement. Its predictability made the weapon even more terrifying. The Hürtgen Forest battle, which had dragged on since September 1944, changed instantly when proximity fuses were authorized on December 18th. Dense trees that once sheltered German defenders became liabilities. Traditional time-fused shells could cause tree bursts, but they were difficult to time correctly. The new fuses detonated at the right height every time. Steel fragments mixed with wooden splinters, creating a storm that shredded anything below. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division fired 12,000 proximity-fused rounds in just 48 hours after authorization. Its after-action report noted an immediate rise in enemy casualties and a collapse in German defensive effectiveness. Medical staff described unusual wound patterns, deep punctures from above clustered around heads and shoulders. Observers saw German soldiers abandon foxholes entirely, trying instead to shelter in bunkers and buildings. This forced them into groups, making them easier targets for conventional shells. The proximity fuse created a tactical trap with no escape. By February 23, 1945, when Operation Grenade, the Allied drive to the Rhine, began, the weapon was fully integrated. The U.S. Ninth Army fired hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells during the first week. German defensive lines, carefully prepared for months, collapsed under airburst fire. The German High Command tried to adapt. A February 10th order demanded that all foxholes be at least 5 meters deep with log coverings 30 centimeters thick, topped with 50 centimeters of earth. On February 18th, the order was revised, requiring movement only through covered trenches and insisting on concrete or steel protection. By February 26th, the directive became desperate. Units will disperse to maximum distance combat effectiveness permits. No more than 2 men in any position. These instructions were impossible to follow. German troops had neither the time, nor the materials, nor the labor to build such defenses under fire. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, highlighted both the power and limits of the fuse. When Lieutenant Karl Timmen requested proximity-fused artillery to slow German troops retreating across the bridge, his commander refused, fearing American forces were too close. This official record showed that VT shells, while revolutionary, required strict control to avoid friendly fire. Meanwhile, Germany tried to restart its own proximity fuse program in 1944. They test-fired several hundred prototypes before the war ended, but production was impossible. German engineers calculated that full-scale manufacture would require 15 new electronics factories, 50,000 specialized workers, 500 tons of refined copper each month, 50 tons of silver for contacts, 2 million vacuum tubes, and 100,000 skilled laborers. Even if resources had existed, German industry lacked the precision tools. American plants used Swiss micrometers accurate to 1/10,000th of an inch. Germany's worn machinery, after 5 years of non-stop war production, could barely manage 1/1000th on good days. Quality control alone was beyond their capability. The irony was striking. German scientists understood the theory well and had begun similar research even before the Americans. But theory was not enough. The United States had not only developed the fuse but built the industrial ecosystem to produce millions of them. Germany could not compete. While the fuse was transforming land warfare in Europe, it reached peak effectiveness in the Pacific. By 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells were devastating Japanese planes. Kamikaze attacks, which threatened to make the invasion of Japan catastrophically costly, were blunted. During the Okinawa campaign, ships with VT shells shot down 91 out of every 100 attacking aircraft. Before proximity fuses, only about 25 out of 100 were destroyed. Admiral Willis Lee later said the fuse had saved 100,000 American lives. Every Japanese plane destroyed by a VT fuse was one that didn't crash into our ships. The dual role of the proximity fuse, deadly against ground troops in Europe and decisive against aircraft in the Pacific, showed the American approach to war production. Mass-produce advanced technology and use it everywhere. Germany, still struggling to produce conventional shells, faced an enemy that put precision electronics into disposable rounds. Studies after the war confirmed the weapon's impact. Against ground targets, it was 3 to 10 times more effective than standard fuses. Against V-1 flying bombs, destruction rates jumped from 24% to 79%. At sea, the rounds per kill rate dropped from over 1,000 to about 300. The 50-fold increase in lethal fragment coverage changed artillery tactics completely. Old doctrine required heavy concentrations of fire to blanket an area. With proximity fuses, dispersed fire achieved the same effect with fewer rounds. That meant less strain on logistics, reduced barrel wear, and more units receiving artillery support. General Patton himself reported that his artillery could now fire shorter, more concentrated barrages, allowing infantry to advance before defenders could recover. This speed increased the pace of Allied offensives in 1945. However, it is important to note that while estimates circulated about huge German casualties, sometimes figures like 250,000 deaths, no documented evidence supports numbers that large. What is clear is that proximity fuses changed both the psychology and practice of warfare. They made traditional defenses obsolete, broke enemy morale, and saved countless Allied lives on both sides of the globe. What history clearly records is how proximity fuses multiplied the power of artillery and broke the confidence of German troops. The German army never fully grasped what they were facing. Behind this success was a massive American effort. About 3% of all U.S. physicists were dedicated to the fuse program, an unprecedented concentration of scientific talent. Combined with industrial strength, the results were staggering. At Crosley Corporation, one assembly line could turn out 500 fuses every hour. Workers performed precise microscopic tasks in seconds, thousands of times per shift. Factories ran day and night, 7 days a week. Even on Christmas Day 1944, production didn't stop, while German troops were being cut down by the very devices these workers built. The supply chain stretched across the country. Copper came from Montana, silver from U.S. Treasury reserves, and new plastics from chemical companies that hadn't even existed 3 years earlier. The mobilization was as complex as the fuse itself. By comparison, German ammunition plants in 1945 were dependent on slave labor, with only 60% of shells passing quality checks. Sabotage by forced workers reduced that number further, and by March 1945, only 30% of German shells worked as intended. The U.S., meanwhile, delivered VT fuses with 94% reliability, despite their advanced electronics. But the proximity fuse story is more than numbers. It changed how war was experienced on the ground. American soldiers gained confidence knowing their artillery could reach enemies in dugouts. German troops lost faith in defenses that had protected soldiers for centuries. First-hand accounts confirm this shift. U.S. forward observers described calling in fire with new certainty, while German veterans recalled the helplessness of hearing shells overhead and realizing that cover meant nothing. The medical side also revealed new realities. The downward spray of fragments produced wounds surgeons had never seen before, concentrated on heads and shoulders. German medical services, already overwhelmed, could not adapt. American medics with access to penicillin and plasma treated their wounded more effectively, multiplying the fuse's impact. The proximity fuse wasn't just a battlefield advantage. It showcased a complete system of science, industry, and military coordination. While Nazi Germany poured billions into wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket, which cost roughly $2 billion, killed about 9,000 people, and offered little strategic payoff, the proximity fuse cost half as much and reshaped both land and air warfare. This comparison reveals two very different philosophies. Germany focused on spectacular breakthroughs, but couldn't produce them in meaningful numbers. America concentrated on evolutionary improvements manufactured at massive scale. The proximity fuse was still just an artillery shell, but it turned artillery into something far deadlier. The program also validated American organizational methods. Scientists at Johns Hopkins, factory workers, and the military worked in sync, moving from concept to large-scale production in under 3 years. Germany's divided research institutions and inter-service rivalries made that impossible. After the war, U.S. intelligence officers examined German proximity fuse research. They found advanced theories but no workable production pathway. Prototypes from Rheinmetall in 1945 used vacuum tubes that shattered under the shock of firing. German engineers tried to harden them, but they never reached the reliability of American models. And even if they had, the industrial base to mass produce them simply didn't exist. The Soviets, who received a small number of fuses through Lend-Lease, lacked technical documents. Their engineers spent 7 years reverse engineering the devices before producing their own in 1952. And even then, their quality still fell below that of American wartime models. This showed how much more was involved than just having an example to copy. Success required infrastructure, quality systems, and expertise that took years to develop. The story of the proximity fuse leaves lasting lessons. First, upgrading existing weapons can be more decisive than inventing brand new ones. Second, mass production is just as important as scientific breakthroughs. Third, integration between scientists, industry, and the military determines real-world power. And finally, secrecy is a double-edged sword. Keeping the fuse hidden until late 1944 preserved surprise, but it also meant months of extra Allied losses that might have been avoided. Above all, the fuse raises deep moral questions. It made killing more certain, more efficient, and more precise. German soldiers in trenches had no defense against shells that exploded at exactly the right height above them. It was a weapon that changed both the psychology and the reality of modern warfare. This was not combat in the traditional sense. It was large-scale destruction on an industrial level. Yet the proximity fuse also shortened the war. Every German division shattered by artillery with proximity fuses was one less defending the concentration camps. The same technology that cut down German troops also sped up the liberation of Nazi victims. Admiral Louis Strauss ranked the proximity fuse among the handful of developments that victory heavily depended on. He also understood the moral complexity. American veterans themselves carried mixed feelings. They were grateful for a weapon that saved American lives, but uneasy about the sheer efficiency with which it killed. Some described walking into German positions where every man had been killed at once by airbursts overhead. The killing felt automatic, as though death had been stripped of human choice. The fuse ultimately symbolized American advantages that went beyond one weapon. It showcased an industrial system that could mass-produce advanced technology, a scientific community that solved problems quickly, and an organization able to coordinate all parts into one. When German infantry came under proximity-fused artillery in December 1944, they were not just meeting a new device. They were facing the full weight of American industrial democracy. It was a system that could invent, build, and deliver advanced weapons while fighting a global war on multiple fronts. The 30 FT between a shell's detonation and the ground symbolized the gap between American capability and German expectations. Within that small distance, measured by radio waves and made possible by miniaturized electronics, lay the proof that democratic industry could outperform authoritarian rule. The proximity fuse did more than change World War II. It marked the beginning of modern smart weapons. Today's precision-guided munitions trace their origins back to those small electronic shells of 1944. The idea of placing intelligence inside ammunition was revolutionary then, but is now standard. The techniques used to build the fuses, clean assembly lines, strict quality checks, and precision work by hand, later formed the basis of the semiconductor industry. The women who built proximity fuses during the war were unknowingly shaping practices still used in electronics manufacturing. The program also taught lasting organizational lessons. It proved that bringing together universities, private industry, and the military into a single effort could succeed. This model later defined Cold War weapons development. The fuse program showed that free societies could mobilize resources and ideas as effectively as, and perhaps more effectively than, dictatorships. This account is drawn from confirmed records and evidence. Production numbers come from Bureau of Ordnance documents. Technical details are based on declassified Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory reports. Battle descriptions come from official after-action studies. Claims without evidence, such as exaggerated casualty figures or unproven German jamming attempts, are excluded. Even without these, what remains is extraordinary. The proximity fuse transformed artillery from a weapon of broad impact into a precision tool. Its development and mass production proved American industrial strength. Its battlefield use accelerated Allied victory. At 30 FT above the ground, democracy overcame fascism, not just through moral arguments, though those mattered, but through reliable, large-scale production. The fuse itself symbolized what Nazi Germany misunderstood about America. Jewish scientists who had fled persecution contributed to its development. Women who could not fight in combat assembled the shells. Diversity, which the Nazis saw as weakness, turned into strength. In total, 22 million proximity fuses were produced. By contrast, Germany struggled to make standard ammunition at consistent quality. The German infantry who faced these weapons in December 1944 were some of the most experienced soldiers in the world. They had conquered much of Europe and endured years of fighting. Yet they died in their dugouts not from a lack of skill or bravery, but from encountering the future. They had only 30 FT, the distance between the detonation of the shell and the ground, to realize that their assumptions about American weakness were false. In that short space, as fragments fell from precise electronic triggers, the illusions of the Third Reich met American reality. The proximity fuse destroyed more than soldiers. It ended the myth of German martial superiority. It crushed the idea that courage alone could hold back advanced technology. In that small gap of altitude, measured by miniature radios and made possible by electronics that seemed impossible to mass produce, America announced that future wars would be decided by those who could imagine, design and manufacture at scale. Every German soldier who fell to proximity-fused firepower died not at the hands of an individual marksman, but through the application of American industrial philosophy. It was not ideology but engineering, not propaganda but production, not theory but the finality of battlefield results. The shells that exploded 30 FT above German foxholes were more than weapons. They were fragments of democracy's argument against fascism, proving that free societies could outproduce, outthink, and ultimately outfight authoritarian powers. The proximity fuse was the closest thing to a perfect democratic weapon. It was advanced yet mass-produced, complex yet reliable, expensive yet expendable. It killed efficiently not through cruelty, but through engineering precision. It ended battles not by barbarism, but through calculated design. It secured victory not through slogans but through industrial strength. The German infantry who faced it stood at the crossroads of history. Centuries of defensive warfare collapsed in minutes. Earthworks that had sheltered soldiers for generations no longer provided safety. The proximity fuse did not just eliminate men, it erased an entire concept of how wars were fought. In December 1944, German troops had 30 FT before the shell bursts overhead shredded their positions. Within that short space lay the difference between the world that had been and the world to come. They measured their graves in meters. America measured its victory in megahertz. The future had arrived, it was mass-produced, and it exploded exactly at 30 FT.